Welcome to another episode of the HoopsHype Podcast. My name is Alex Kennedy, and joining me today is a top NBA reporter from FS1, Chris Broussard. Chris, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Alex. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for jumping on today. We don't really have a lot to talk about usually in late August, but very busy time in the NBA right now. We just had a blockbuster trade go down recently between Boston and Cleveland. I want to get your thoughts on that. We're going to talk about, the NBA offseason as a whole and your career, but let's start with this trade. Now, you have Kyrie Irving for Isaiah Thomas, Jay Crowder, and the Brooklyn Nets pick. But recently, obviously, the Isaiah Thomas physical has kind of held things up. What's the latest on the situation? Do you think this trade goes through? Does Boston add more? What are your thoughts on where things stand right now?
Well, right now, it's obviously a game of chicken. Boston's not going to want to add anything to the deal because they feel like they were very open and transparent about Isaiah Thomas's injury, and they were publicly, and if they did it publicly, I'm sure they did it privately. However, Cleveland, it's always different when you get to see the MRI yourself, and you have your own doctors evaluate a player, and that's obviously what Cleveland has done, and now they feel like the injury's a little worse, or the timetable for Isaiah to come back is a little longer than they expected. So, kudos to them for trying to sweeten the deal. Look, there's been talk about, will they go after Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown? Sure, they'll go after those guys, but they're not likely to get that. I think what will happen is the deal will be made, and I think Cleveland will get either a second-round pick or a future first. That's a low first round, like maybe Boston's first-round pick next year, which would be a low pick in the first round. But there's too much incentive for both teams to get this done. For Cleveland, they're not likely to get a better deal on the market. We know Phoenix, they had talks with them, but they don't want to give up the young player in Josh Jackson. And then Kyrie doesn't want to go. We know he doesn't want to go back there, but He may not even go back for training camp if, they don't make the deal. And then in Boston, this has definitely changed the relationship with Isaiah Thomas and to a lesser extent Jay Crowder. But, Isaiah Thomas emotionally been upset about the trade. It would be tough to bring him back under this situation, especially when he's in the last year of his deal. So I think the incentive is so strong for both teams to get this done. And I think both teams even got a good deal. I thought Cleveland won the deal as it was, assuming Isaiah will be back, maybe even if it's November or early December, and be back to the form he showed last year. So I still think it gets done.
Yeah, it's one of those few trades where both sides seem like they got what they wanted, and I agree with you. I think it gets done as well. I'm surprised this doesn't happen more often because we see a number of trades that, occur where there is an injured player or a guy that's coming off an injury. And it surprises me that more teams don't try to do this. Now, I don't know if that's because they don't want to upset other teams and it's it's not really operating in good faith. But it seems like if you have a chance to put a player in front of your doctor and you can find something, or your assessment's different than another team's assessment and you can get more out of a deal, then, I'm surprised more teams haven't tried this. Is that something that happens more often, or is it something that's kind of discouraged? Why does that not happen more?
Yeah, you don't want to, first of all, I know Boston thinks Cleveland's just trying to get a better deal. I believe they're being sincere. I don't think it's that they're trying to get a better deal. I think it's just that they are a little bit more, concerned about Isaiah's injury now that they've had their doctors look at it than they were before when they made the trade. It is not good practice, and you don't want to develop a reputation as a team that's kind of, two-faced like that. And, because obviously you have to deal with teams throughout the year. You have to make deals throughout the year, and you don't want to be known as a GM or a front office that is always trying to swindle another team. Now, everybody knows you're always trying to get the best deal, but once you make an agreement your word has to stand. I think Cleveland is justified in revisiting this trade, but in most cases, you certainly don't want to make a habit of that because word can get out and teams may not want to deal with you, which obviously isn't good.
Yeah, once you start changing terms of deals, I guess that's where it does get kind of tricky. And then obviously, as you mentioned, players get upset too. So if it did fall apart, then you could have a scenario where your players are coming back, and that's not what you want.
Well, that's why, like you said, you got to deal with your players in that situation, which obviously isn't good. And the other team, you're putting them in a terrible situation. Like if Cleveland pulls out of this deal, which I don't think they will, now look what's Boston, their situation with Isaiah.
It kind of reminds me of the Lakers with Lamar Odom.
Exactly. That's a great example. That's why you don't see this thing happening a lot more often.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, let's talk about these two teams and how they look after the trade, assuming it goes through. I don't think we're going to see any key pieces added in terms of players. It's probably just going to be a draft pick, maybe two if we're talking about second rounders. So let's talk about Boston with Kyrie Irving and Cleveland with Isaiah Thomas and Jay Crowder. Which of these teams now is the best team in the Eastern Conference, in your opinion? And did either team close the gap on the Warriors? That's the big question. Is this all for naught? I mean, are the Warriors still, way ahead of everyone in terms of the field?
Well, I think Cleveland is still the best team in the East, mainly because they have LeBron James. And as long as he didn't show any or much drop-off, in the off season, remember he will be in his 15th year, then they're still going to be the best team. They were light years ahead of Boston last year. Nobody really, Boston was the number one seed only because Cleveland really coasted through the regular season. And you saw that in the Eastern Conference playoffs, how they could really turn it up. So I think they're still the cream of the crop in the East. And in addition to LeBron, I think there are a few other reasons. One, Kyrie Irving is undoubtedly the best player in this trade. He's better than Isaiah Thomas. However, Isaiah does, assuming he's going to be healthy, and even if it's December, even late December when he gets back, that's fine. You've dealt with that with Kyrie Irving before. Isaiah essentially gives you the same amount of production offensively that Kyrie gives you. He scores just as much. Obviously, last year he scored more. He assists. He's the same type of passer that Kyrie is, roughly around 5 or 6 assists a game. He is not as good of an outside shooter as Kyrie, which is important when you play off LeBron James. However, he still is a good shooter. He's a very good shooter. And he's finishes at the rim, not as well as Kyrie, but he's a good finisher, penetrator, isolation, one-on-one type player. What he does better than Kyrie is he gets to the foul line even more, almost twice as much as Kyrie did last year. So I think offensively they're getting roughly the same type of production from Isaiah. Then you add in Jay Crowder.
Yeah, I love the Crowder pickup.
Oh, yeah, that's huge. I said all last year that Cleveland lost its identity. They went from being a tough, hard-nosed, defensive-minded team that gets physical with you and can beat you up to this finesse three-point shooting team that wanted to play like Golden State. And their defense was atrocious. We know that through especially the second half of the regular season. Now I think with Crowder, I think it's an unheralded pickup of Jeff Green. And I'm not saying he's great as a free agent, but for an 8th or 9th man, he's a pretty good guy, and he can give you some versatility because he's another guy you can throw out there and defend on the wing. So now with Crowder and with Jeff Green, I think that will help them get back to being a tougher team, defensively more physical. Obviously, Crowder, you can put him on a Kevin Durant and things like that and give LeBron a break. So I think it helped them in that regard. I also think it gives them a little more edge than they had before. Same with Isaiah, who I failed to mention. Kyrie was clutch, but Isaiah's clutch as well. I wouldn't put him as good as Kyrie in the clutch, but we know he was a great fourth quarter scorer. So he's mentally tough, 53 points on his late sister's birthday, would have been her birthday. So, I think he's mentally tough as well. And he's a motivated player because he's in his contract year and obviously wants to play well, get a max deal. And what he needs to do, he showed last year how great he is individually. He showed he can lead a team to victories. What he has to do now is obviously show that he's healthy, but beyond that, show that he can play with another star, play well, and help them elevate as a team and win. So he's very motivated to be at his best. Then obviously you throw in Brooklyn's pick, and who knows what that could turn into. I mean, maybe it turns into, a Michael Porter or Marvin Bagley who could become a top player of the next era. So I think it was phenomenal for Cleveland. I think it was great for both teams, as you said, but Cleveland won the deal, in my opinion. Now, Boston got better. Whereas last year they had one star, now they've got two. And I think probably one, Kyrie's certainly better than Isaiah. And some would argue Hayward is better than Isaiah. We'll see how he plays there next year. The challenge for Boston is that they are relying on a lot of young players now. Jaylen Brown, let's see what he can do in the escalated minutes that he's going to get. Jason Tatum, let's see what he does. And Marcus Morris is a very good player, but has only played in 4 playoff games in his career. So he's going to be on a much bigger stage. Much more is expected. The lights will be brighter. And, let's see how he reacts to that. But beyond that, they're going to have to develop chemistry. They've got a great coach in Brad Stevens who can do that. But remember, they've only got, I think, 4 players from last year's team. A lot of the guys who were their heart and soul, Avery Bradley, Jay Crowder, even though Lindick, those guys are they're gone now. And so they're going to have to, develop the chemistry that, they haven't had, because, it's a different type of point guard that Hayward's going to be playing with now in Kyrie. So all of those are question marks. I think they'll overcome them and still be very good, but they just have to make some adjustments to new players. As far as the Warriors, I think Cleveland is better, and believe it or not, I think they're better, a lot of because of the defense and stuff, than they were last year. I think the chemistry will be a little better just because Kyrie didn't want to be there, obviously. But I think they got a little bit closer to Golden State. I think they're probably more capable of defending them. But I still think the Warriors are the better team, and I would pick them, definitely pick them in the finals. And I think it will be Cleveland Golden State again. I think the Warriors will be even better because remember I thought they'd overcome it. As soon as Durant went there, I thought they'd win the championship. They obviously did. But they still have some growing pains with Steph and Durant, getting to know each other, getting to play together, how they're going to figure it out. We know Steph, kind of took a step back. And then when Durant got injured, that's when Steph went back to his old ways. And when Durant came back, they didn't miss a beat. They both, were playing at the top of their game. I think that this year there won't be those issues. Everybody kind of knows where they are, their role, the pecking order, and all that. And I think they'll just run through the league. They could – I think they definitely could win 73 or 74 games, but I don't think they want to. I don't think they'll try, but I think they'd be capable of it if they wanted.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think people are looking at this Warriors team like they were last year, but I don't think people understand how much better a team gets in year two. It's so hard in that first year when you're adding multiple stars to one team and they're having to adjust to each other. And Kevin Durant's learning, to play with, under Steve Kerr, play with new stars. The chemistry is going to be
Yep.
better. I think they did a really good job this offseason adding Nick Young and Omri Caspi, two more shooters. They're going to
Yep.
be a much better team. So if I'm a team like Boston or Cleveland, you're hoping that your team exceeds expectations and that the Warriors take a step back. But it's just hard to imagine anyone beating Golden State right now. So let's talk about LeBron James, because obviously he's going to be the reason that Cleveland beats Golden State if it happens. But there's been so much talk about his future. He can test free agency after next season. There's been talk about Los Angeles. There's been, a number of different rumors. He hasn't really committed long term, and there were talks that, during the Kyrie negotiations, that was an issue. They were trying to, build a team that can win now while also preparing for the future in case LeBron James leaves. And I think that's why having, that Nets pick is so important to Cleveland. What do you think happens with LeBron James? Do you think he knows where he wants to go right now, or do you think he's kind of playing it by ear? And if you had to predict, where do you think LeBron James ultimately ends up?
Wow. Well, I think the talk about the Lakers is overblown. Doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but I just think that, to answer your question, LeBron at this point doesn't know what he's going to do. We know that this has been his MO for the last several years. Even when he went back to Cleveland from Miami, it was a short-term deal. And so he wants to keep his options open for various reasons, to keep Dan Gilbert on edge, to keep him trying to make the team better, and just for other personal reasons that LeBron seems to like playing in this situation. So I think that's his MO, and I don't think we should assume that he's definitely out of there because he won't commit long term. However, there is reason to believe he would leave. I mean, heading into the draft, we know that Cleveland had a deal on the table where they could have gotten Eric Bledsoe and Paul George for Kyrie Irving in a 3-team deal. And Dan Gilbert went to LeBron and wanted him to sign long term. He said, I'll do the deal if you'll sign long term. And I'm told that Paul George actually was willing not to commit to a long-term deal, but he told Cleveland, look, if you do this, I will extend, I'll pick up my 1-year option.
Yeah,
so
that's
he would
huge.
have been there for 2 years. Yeah. And LeBron still did not commit long-term. Now, again, I'm not saying that definitely means he's gone, but it certainly would make you is a red flag, because if you're getting Paul George for 2 years and you're getting blessed, I mean, that's a great deal for Cleveland, as good as Kyrie Irving is. That's a deal that I think would put you, again, I still probably favor Golden State, but I think Cleveland will be right there. I mean, I think it'd be a very competitive finals, and Cleveland will be capable of winning.
Yeah.
And LeBron still didn't want to do it. So there's reason to believe he could be leaving. But here's the thing you have to understand. Remember LeBron's past, when he left Cleveland the first time and then left Miami to go back to Cleveland. In both instances, nobody had a clue as to what he was going to do until a day or two before. In fact, most of the league assumed he was staying in Cleveland.
Yeah.
And then most of the league assumed he was staying in Miami. So the fact is that LeBron's group keeps it very close to the vest. I mean, if anybody knows where he's going, it's his wife, his agent, and Maverick Carter, his business manager, maybe Randy Mims, his associate, and nobody else.
Yeah.
Adam Mendelson's his PR guy, maybe, but nobody else, and they're not talking. And again, I don't think LeBron knows where he's going. So I think he's keeping his options open. So to think that this time all of LeBron's business is in the streets, whereas in the past nobody's ever known what he's doing. Now all of a sudden, a year in advance, everybody knows what LeBron James is going to do. It just doesn't make sense. And, we all talk to people around the league about other teams and get a sense for what other guys, what they're thinking players or teams will do. But a lot of times it's wrong. I mean, everybody thought Russell Westbrook was out of Oklahoma City. They thought he was going to either the Lakers, where he's from, or to New York. And, of course, he signs the extension. So the fact that other executives think LeBron's out of there, and they do, doesn't mean a thing, though. It doesn't mean that they're accurate in knowing, especially with a guy like LeBron who keeps things very secretive. So if I had to guess, I know there are people while the organization is certainly doing its due diligence and being wise by planning for a future without LeBron, I know there are people in that organization that still think he's not leaving. This is all just a bunch of, drama and talk, and we know LeBron likes drama. So I would, if I had to, and again, this we don't know, but if I had to make a pick, I would say he does stay in Cleveland. I wouldn't bet my house on it. If I had to you put a gun to my head, I would say right now he stays in Cleveland. If he leaves, especially if he goes west to the Lakers, very good chance you're not getting back to the finals. With the Lakers, there's so many questions. Let's see what Lonzo Ball is.
Brandon Ingram too.
Brandon Ingram is. Let's see what Paul George is willing to do. If LeBron, I don't see LeBron going there by himself without another star. So what if Oklahoma City gets to the Western Conference and finals and loses in 7 or
does Paul
6?
George stay?
Yeah. So I think there's too many questions for LeBron to know at this point where he's gonna go.
Now, one listener asked this, what about Houston? Because he obviously has the close ties to Chris Paul. He'd have another star there in James Harden. We know Daryl Morey's always wheeling and dealing. That team hasn't really come up a lot in terms of the LeBron James conversation. If he is wanting to leave and look for a situation where he could potentially beat the Golden State Warriors, could you see him going to Houston, teaming up with Chris Paul and James Harden, and then trying to put some pieces around that group? So you have a big three and then maybe some pieces around them?
Yeah, that would be a heck of a chemistry project.
Yes, it would. All those guys need the ball in their hands. That's true.
Oh, my gosh. I think it's going to be that way this year for Houston.
I agree.
Chris and Harden are saying the right things, and I really think they mean it in their heart, but it's a whole different matter of getting out there and playing that way. I actually think they'll be better in the playoffs than they are in the regular season. But look, you never say never. We know how close Chris and LeBron are, but I think that would be a long shot. I'll say this. As much talent as that Houston team would have, I still would not pick them over Golden State because, as we've seen throughout the history of basketball, it's not just talent. It is also fit. And, one of the great things about the all-time great teams is obviously they've had a lot of talent, but the pieces fit together seamlessly. Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, James Worthy, they fit together perfectly. Everybody knew their role. Everybody did something different. Golden State, I knew Durant would fit in seamlessly because of his game. He can catch and shoot. He doesn't dominate the basketball. In LeBron, James Harden, and Chris Paul, you got three guys that not only need the ball in their hands, they dominate the basketball.
Right.
That's why Miami, it wasn't it took them a year. I think they clearly were better than Dallas that year. They lost their first time together. But I don't think they were an all-time great team in Miami with LeBron and Wade because I don't think the pieces fit great together. They were just so good individually, LeBron, Wade, and then Bosh to a lesser extent, that they won 2 championships. But they weren't a great fit. You know that because all 3 players could not play at their highest level together. LeBron was able to play at his highest level. Dwayne Wade stepped back and let LeBron dominate, and I think really became about 80% of the player he could have been. Because he stepped back, came off the ball, and let LeBron do his thing for the sake of the team, and I think he deserves a ton of credit for that. And then Bosh stepped back even more. I mean,
he sacrificed a ton.
Oh, my gosh, he became a glorified role player. His last year there, when they went to the finals, he averaged 16 points and 6 rebounds. I mean, this is a guy who was 22-11 in Toronto. And so he wasn't able to play at his highest level. So I don't think that would even be a team. I mean, look, you never say never with LeBron and other great players like that, but I still would look at Golden State. I think if LeBron James leaves Cleveland and it is all about winning, if it's not because I want to be in L.A., I'm ready to, maximize my business opportunities. I want the glamour market, all that. If it's none of that, if it's not, I want to go play with my friend Chris Paul or whoever. If it is all about where I can win more championships, then I think the best move for him would be to go to San Antonio.
Yeah.
Because the one thing about LeBron, and I actually do think that this is unfortunate, and I think it hurts him when you talk about the GOAT conversation. I think he's, in my book, I've been on record as saying I think he's the second best player of all time behind Michael Jordan. The one thing, if you look at a lot of the greats, Michael Jordan played for Phil Jackson. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had Pat Riley. Magic Johnson had Pat Riley. Tim Duncan had Greg Popovich. LeBron, with all due respect to Eric Spoelstra, Ty Lue, Mike Brown, who are good coaches, he has never had that iconic coach, that legendary coach who would have really been able to fully coach him. LeBron has been in a situation a lot of times where he's kind of been able to do whatever he wants. Miami, was able to coach him more than any other place because Pat Riley was such a strong presence in the front office. But even still, LeBron is able to kind of become the system. I think if he had played in his prime for a Popovich, a Phil Jackson, a Pat Riley, and they would have made him acclimate to their system, I think it's very possible. I think there's no doubt he'd have more championships.
Yeah.
Would he have 6 or 5? I don't know. And I failed to mention Kobe playing for Phil Jackson.
Right.
So I think that is one reason LeBron doesn't have as many rings or more rings. And I think if he went to San Antonio with Kawhi Leonard, we know the Spurs, that's a lot of talent, obviously. But with them, it's not just about talent. I mean, Popovich is always making them a 60-win team, no matter who they have. And if he were to go to San Antonio, I think they'd be right there with Golden State with the combination of Kawhi and Popovich and LeBron and whoever else they had.
And others would want to join too, I think. Others we've seen San Antonio can attract talent. Everyone knows, they're the model organization. I think that's probably Golden State's biggest nightmare. That's the worst case scenario for the Warriors because you have perimeter defenders and Kawhi and LeBron. You have pieces around them. Pop is a genius. I agree with you. I think if it is just about winning, San Antonio becomes very interesting. But the question is, is it just about winning? Is he going to put those business pursuits and some of the other stuff, ahead of that? That's kind of the big question.
Yeah.
But no, I think that's an interesting team that hasn't really been talked about a whole lot. I want to throw one more basketball question at you before we move on to your career and kind of talk about, your rise throughout this industry. Carmelo Anthony. Now, we heard a lot about this at the beginning of the summer. Obviously, when you have Chris Paul, Paul George, Jimmy Butler, Kyrie Irving. You have all these guys traded. There's been, a distraction a little bit. People have moved on from the Carmelo story. But how does this play out? Does he get traded to Houston? Does he stay with the Knicks and start the season in New York? Is there a buyout eventually? How does this situation play out in your opinion?
Yeah, this is interesting. Again, we know that there's so many scenarios on the table. You can't rule out anything. But the way it's looking right now, if I had to bet, I would think that he starts the season in New York. Now, we know a lot of their promotional material hasn't featured him, which could be a sign that, maybe he won't be there.
Yeah.
But the Houston deal, it's just, and Daryl Morey is a great wheeler and dealer. So, maybe he could come up with some type of 3 or 4 team deal. But he's just been unable to do so at this point. And, Houston's motivated. New York's motivated. The agents for not only Melo, well, it's the same agent, Melo and Chris Paul, CAA is motivated because they want to make Houston as good as it can be. Because Chris Paul gave up a ton of money and security to leave the Clippers and go to the Rockets, which tells you how bad it was in L.A.
Right.
A player at his age who has been injured quite a bit, leaves 4 years on the table at max money to go to a team where he's going to play on a 1-year deal. And it's a very good chance that Houston doesn't win the 53 games that they won last year. I believe it was 53. Even though they may end up being better, going maybe a little deeper in the playoffs, maybe. But it's a good chance they're not quite as good. And if they're not as good next year as they were this past year, are they giving Chris the max? That's a big question mark. And so the agents, they want to get Melo there to make Houston better, sexier, a bigger draw, and a deeper team in the playoffs. So there's a lot of incentive to get this done, but it's just a very difficult deal. And New York, especially under its new regime, is not just going to give Melo up for nothing for a deal that they don't think is good just because they think it might, improve chemistry. On the other hand, I know Melo doesn't want to go back to New York,
right?
But he does like New York. That's the thing. This trade, him forcing his way out of Denver to New York, has certainly not worked out basketball-wise. But as far as his brand, as far as his, business pursuits and all his celebrity, all of that rose when he was in New York. And he understands that. And think about it. If it was just about winning, Melo would have left and gone to Chicago or somewhere else when he was a free agent a few years ago. If it was just about winning, he probably would have never went to New York in the first place because Denver was a very good team when he left. They had just, a couple years ago, before that, been to the conference finals. And so if it was just about winning, I think he'd look at an Oklahoma City. He'd be open to a Portland. He'd be more open to a Cleveland. I think he maybe would go there at the end of the day if it came to that. But so, Melo in his heart of hearts does like being in New York City and how it can prepare him for life after basketball and all of that. So, again, not knowing, there's obviously a lot of stuff can happen, but I would probably say he starts training camp with the Cavs with the Knicks at this point.
Yeah, it's just so strange. It seemed like, a month ago or even a few weeks ago, everyone was talking about this thing like it was done. Chris Paul was telling Mark Spears, just sit back and wait. You had people behind the scenes acting like it was done, that it was inevitable that Melo would be in Houston, and then it just didn't happen. So I think, if it was going to happen, we may have already seen it happen. So we'll see what happens. Like you mentioned, I think he could start the season in New York, and then Houston's going to keep kind of circling throughout the year, and I'm sure other teams will as well. But then we'll see if as the trade deadline gets closer or as the start of the season gets closer, this gets revisited. Now, I want to talk about your career. Obviously you're a household name. You went from ESPN to Fox Sports 1. You have 1.3 million followers on Twitter. I want to talk about your journey to this point, because I think there's a lot of people that know you now, but they don't necessarily know, the grind and the work that you put in early on in your career. In the early 90s, you wrote for The Plain Dealer. Then you went to the Akron Beacon Journal. Then you were at the New York Times. Early on in your career, kind of talk about what was the experience like for you? What are some lessons you learned early on that allowed you to get to this point and become, a national name, a national figure in NBA reporting?
Well, I started out at the Cleveland Plain Dealer in 1990, and I was a part-time reporter. And actually, my first 9 months at the Plain Dealer, I was just sitting in the office answering phones, and learning Agate, which a lot of people don't even understand what that is at this point. But that's the transactions and statistics and records, standings pages in the sports page. So I learned how to do all of that. And then after that, I covered high school sports for 4 years. And some great memories from that. I mean, it's so much different from covering the pros.
Yeah.
You had to keep your own statistics. You're sitting in the bleachers sometimes in a football game. And it's cold or it's raining or it may even be snowing in Ohio, or you're in a small press box and you're keeping all the statistics, yards per carry, turnovers. In basketball games, I'm keeping, turnovers, field goals attempts, rebounds. You didn't have to, but I was very tedious with all that stuff. And then you write your stories in crazy circumstances. I wrote stories in my car. I wrote stories a lot of times, in the press box. I got locked in schools, had to climb over barbed wire fences to get out. I mean, I sent stories because back then it wasn't email. It was something similar, like a very basic, rudimentary precursor to email where you had to attach your phone or your computer to a phone, a lot of times a payphone. Back then, I sent stories from clubs, from nightclubs, running in like, hey, I'm on deadline. I know this sounds crazy, but I work for the Plain Dealer. I got high school, right? I got to send this story. So some really fun memories. And the sense of urgency back then was it was very like energizing and invigorating. But so I went from that, and then I got my big break. Like I was at the Cleveland Plain Dealer 4 years as a part-time reporter. Now the first editor who hired me there, he told me as soon as we get a full-time opening, you got it. We just don't have one now, but we want to get you in the door. And, just as any way we can at this point. And then he left after maybe eight or 9 months. His friend or a guy he was very close with took over, and he understood the deal too. But then he ended up leaving. And then by the time the third sports editor came in, he didn't really know that I was supposed to go full-time or whatever. Yeah. So they got a full-time opening, and I talked to him about it, and I didn't get it. And in talking to him, I understood. I was like, he doesn't even know. He ain't even reading my stuff. Like I was out at a bureau. I wasn't even in Cleveland. I was in the Akron area. So I was covering Akron area high schools. The people in Cleveland weren't receiving a lot of the stories I was writing. They were the people in Akron who got the Plain Dealer were seeing my stories, because this was before the internet and all that.
Right.
So I felt like the sports editor wasn't even really familiar with my writing and my reporting. So I made the decision. The Akron Beacon Journal, which was a smaller newspaper, but I thought at the time was a better newspaper, they came after me and offered me a full-time job. So I left there and I left the Plain Dealer and went to the Beacon Journal. And again, they offered me the Ohio State beat, where I would have had to move from Cleveland to Columbus. But I didn't want to move, and I was engaged to be married, and, I just I wasn't ready to move. And so they just hired me full time, but the only opening they had was like working as a copy editor half the time and as a writer the other half of the time.
Yeah.
So again, I'm sitting in the office for like 6 months, but it actually helped me because in editing, they knew I wasn't going to be like a lifetime, long-time editor. So I wasn't quite doing it to the level of a lot of the other copy editors. But so that gave me a lot of time to sit in the office and read a lot of the better writers around the country because I was seeing the wire. Again, the internet was not in existence, or at least not big in 1995. And so it wasn't like today where you can go and read the Washington Post and the New York Times and all these different websites easily. So the fact that I was in the office and I was able to read all these different writers from around the country, that helped me improve my writing. And then just learn some more ins and outs of editing and things like that, what they're looking for in a story. So then I began, in addition to doing that, I was covering some high school sports. And obviously, whether I was at the Plain Dealer or the Beacon, I covered Akron, St. Vincent, St. Mary a lot, where LeBron James went. But he was a kid. He was like maybe 8 or 9 years old when I was covering that, and even younger when I was covering that high school. But they're a powerhouse even before LeBron. They weren't a national powerhouse, but they were a good team in the state in football and basketball. So I covered them a lot. And then I started covering pro soccer, not for a year, but just for a couple of months. And then my biggest break, or I should say really the precursor to my biggest break, was when they put me on, I became the second beat writer for the Cleveland Indians. And it was only for about four or 5 months, but it was in 95 when they went to the World Series for the first time in decades.
Yeah.
With Albert Bell and Kenny Lofton and Manny Ramirez and all these guys. And so that was really my first prolonged coverage of a professional sport. So I was with them toward the end of the regular season, and then during the playoffs, and then during the World Series. And it was during that time when the Beacon liked the way I was covering the team or writing the stories I was writing. And they told me, like in June, because I had just gotten back from my honeymoon, and they promoted me to cover the Cavaliers. And so I went literally they promoted me from basically a high school writer to the Cavaliers. And then I went from Game 6. I remember vividly. I was at Game 6 when Cleveland lost to Atlanta, and the series was over. So I'm in Atlanta. I fly back to Cleveland the next day, and then the very next day I'm at a Cavaliers event to cover that team, start covering them. My first year on the beat, I believe I worked 188 straight days.
Man.
And I was young, and I think I was 26 years old. I was so young. Was I 26, 20, maybe 27, something like that. But I was young and obviously excited about the promotion. I didn't even think about more money. I didn't even think about a day off, 2 days off. Whatever. I just was in, and I was covering the team. I was working my tail off, you know.
Yeah,
And
you're
so,
not in high school bleachers and having to file from nightclubs, so you're living life. You're living the good life now, right?
Oh, look, man, the way your perspective changes is incredible. Like when I went from, I was at the Beacon, and when I first got there, I was also covering a few college games for the University of Akron and stuff. And so remember, I'm a high school writer. So they sent me to cover Eastern Michigan against the University of Akron basketball. And it was Earl Boykins playing at Eastern Michigan. Remember the 5'5" NBA player. I covered Earl in high school, college, and then the pros. But so I fly into Michigan and then have to rent a car and drive like an hour. And then I'm staying at a Red Roof Inn. And to me, I was sitting there like, man, this is the life.
I made it.
I'm in a Red Roof Inn. My food is paid for, all that. And, of course, now, once you start covering the NBA, you're staying at 4-star and 5-star hotels.
Yeah.
And, I got to be honest. I don't have a big head and all that, but it would be hard for me to stay at a Red Roof Inn now covering again, And I would be with guys who had covered. I remember when I covered the Indians in the playoffs, and one of the guy who was the Cavs beat writer at that time, they also put him on the series, because we had a bunch of writers at that point covering the team, and we were in a Holiday Inn, and the top beat writer and columnist, they were in a nicer hotel. And so the Cavs guy was like complaining, man, this is a trash. What are we doing here? I can't believe they got us here. And this is garbage, blah, blah, blah. And I'm sitting there in my mind thinking, yo, this dude is tripping. Like, this is great. What's the problem? And he actually told me, he might have sensed it, because I didn't say anything to him, but he might have sensed it in my face or whatever. And he was like, look, when you start covering the Cavs, you'll understand.
You'll see.
Your standards will rise. And I was like, all right. So, and he's right. It did happen. But
yeah. It's interesting though, because I think people hear the name Chris Broussard and they think NBA immediately. But you covered baseball, soccer, high school sports, college sports. Was the NBA always your end goal?
No, you're right about that. You do get pigeonholed, and understandably, I've been covering the NBA now for over 20 years. But no, I mean, it very easily could have been baseball or football.
Yeah.
Growing up, football was my favorite sport. And I ended up playing basketball in college. But football was my favorite sport. And if my break had come in the NFL, I could have easily been an NFL reporter all these years, or baseball. And it's interesting because the dynamic in all three sports is very different. And look, things are so different nowadays than they used to be, that some of this may not be applicable to today. But, when you have a 16-game season versus an 82-game season, you're talking about 8 road games versus 41 road games. I mean, when you're covering the NBA, even though you only have 41 road games, you're essentially gone all the time, or away from your family. Like, I was married. I just got married. We had kids a few years later. And so when I'm traveling, you're not just away from your family for the 41 road games, which is more like 80-something nights, because you're not just flying in the day of the game.
Right.
It's maybe more than that, because sometimes you're there the night before the game, then you're there the night of the game, and then sometimes even the day after. But it's also home games, because like, let's say I fly home from a game the night before and I fly in the next morning. When I get home, I'm home during the day. My family my wife is at work, so I'm not seeing her. Then I leave that afternoon to go to the game that night. And even though it's a home game, I'm gone from maybe 4 p.m. to 1 a.m.
Right.
And so I'm not seeing her then. So
and that's before the draft, the combine, the finals, all that stuff that gets thrown in.
Exactly. So, summer league and like you said, the combine. And the NFL, you only got 8 road games, and, you practice, you have practices during the week. You don't have games during the week. So that's a different dynamic. And then baseball is even more so because obviously you got the 162 games and you got, or 61 games, and you got, when you write game stories, it's such a slow pace because 9 innings is not a ton of action going on, and you're just sitting there writing throughout the game, whereas the NBA is a lot more urgent when you cover it. So it's a very different dynamic. If I had to make my choice, it would be the NBA. So I'm glad it worked out that way. Yeah. But it could have very easily been any other sport because when I cover high schools, I covered everything.
Now, I want to throw a few things at you just about being, a top NBA reporter in today's day and age. The first one I want to ask you, developing relationships. It seems like that's one of the most important things. It's how you break news. It's how you are able to, get your name out there more because you are breaking news and getting, big interviews. How important is developing relationships and how much time and effort behind the scenes is put into that for people who don't see? They see the end result, but they don't see all the stuff that goes on behind the scenes. So how important are those relationships?
Oh, well, that's the key. Getting sources is it's an art, not a science. It's just about developing the relationships, to your point. And so it could be relationships with obviously front office people, other people within the organization, coaches, assistant coaches, players, agents, friends of players, people around the players. You never know who could end up being, a good source. So it does take a lot of time. And in some cases, some guys do it by just, their relational skills, and you develop a person's trust. You never want to burn a person. You never want to let it get out who you're talking to, who your sources are, because if it does, not only could you burn that source, but if the word spreads that, you can't, your word can't be trusted.
Others
then
here,
that can, exactly. But then there are guys that work in other ways where, they try to use the power of their pen, and kind of bully people into being sources. And for some people that works. That's not my personality. I've never done that, but to each his own, and whatever works for different writers. But it's a very big part of the business. You do have to work the phones a lot. And today is so much different. More news breaks than ever because of technology. Like back when you used to have to actually call, you had to call on the phone people. You weren't able to get GMs, as many GMs, in contact with them in any given day as you are now. I mean, now with texting, you can contact people from every team every day. Whereas before, if you could get a handful of guys from different teams every day, but just because, with the phone and even, even before cell phones, it really was problematic, So now more news breaks, and that's why because of the technology. That's why more news is able to break today than ever before.
How competitive are you when it comes to breaking news? Because it seems like people who break news in the NBA, they've almost become characters. They're part of the story. They're part of the NBA culture. You know, people like Woj, people like, you know, Shams, yourself, you know, are you competitive? And you know, do you you know, kind of measure yourself against other reporters, or do you just kind of, you know, take what you can get and put it out there whenever you get stuff? How do you kind of approach that? Because I know some writers are super competitive. Like Adam Schefter, for example, always talks about every offseason he has a list of free agents and he assigns points for each one. So he's like trying to, you know, beat himself every summer and beat others as well. How do you approach it from a competitive standpoint?
Yeah, I'm not like a Woj or a Schefter or Mark Stein used to be, who I work closely with at ESPN. I'm not like that in terms of that competitiveness. I'm a very competitive person in general, but I'm not.
I've heard some Chris Broussard basketball stories, so I believe it. I've heard you on the court
I'll talk some trash
working some guys.
I'm getting older now, but I'm not obsessed with it, and be honest, that's one big reason. Really, was the main reason that I left ESPN and went to FS1, because ESPN, they offered me another contract, and they wanted to have me strictly as a reporter and newsbreaker, and FS1 wanted me as a personality and opinionist, more in the mold of a Stephen A. Smith, Dan Lebatard, Bomani Jones. You know, not that I'm going to be that type of personality, but, you know, those guys aren't breaking news.
Yeah,
they're
it's just a different
giving
role.
Their opinions. Yeah, they're giving their opinions on what the news and what's going on. And I wanted that. I wanted to transition into that position rather than be a newsbreaker. And so that's the only reason I actually left ESPN and went to FS1. So now I'm not even really trying to break news. I'm just, you know, I'm an analyst and opinionist at FS1. Obviously, the NBA is a specialty of mine, but I do a radio show, and we talk about boxing. We talk about football, not much baseball, but, you know, when it's relevant, we'll talk about baseball. Obviously basketball, you know, so I talk about plenty of other sports, and even on some of the talk shows, Undisputed, Speak for Yourself, The Herd, you may hear me talk about and debate other sports. So I'm kind of moving out of that, or I have moved out of that newsbreaker role. And to be honest, that really, even before that, I was not obsessed with it. Yeah. And, you know, that's a big reason I didn't break as many stories as some of these other guys, because when I went to, so this goes along with, we were talking about my career. I was at the New York Times from 98 to 2004. And I was a beat writer for the Nets, then the Knicks, then 1 year on the NBA. Obviously, as a beat writer, you're competitive. You're trying to break stories. So I was doing that then. But when I left there in 2004, I went from the New York Times to ESPN, the magazine. I went as a feature writer for the magazine. And so, and I told ESPN.com, because I told them, I said, look, I'm not trying to write, and again, this is early days of the internet. I said, I'm not trying to write for the internet. I said, if I want to stay on the daily grind, then I'll stay at the New York Times. I'm coming here to be a features writer, write feature stories, kind of like a Lee Jenkins, you know, is doing for Sports Illustrated. I want to do feature stories about, you know, it was the NBA. I mean, I did a few others, but mainly NBA guys. And so that's how I got in relatively close with LeBron James, was that I did a ton of feature stories on him for the magazine. So I was doing that, and then they would have me on television for my information.
Yeah, so, and the role kind of just morphed.
I was plugged in, so I had good information. And then, they had me doing more and more TV. And the real change happened in 2010. when LeBron and Dwayne Wade and Amari Stoudemire and Chris Bosh and Joe Johnson, all these guys were free agents. And when ESPN, they set a schedule for, okay, we got Rick Bucher, Jay Adonde, Chris Broussard, Mark Stein, you all are going to be on TV, and this is your schedule. So Chris is during the day, J.A. is at night, then some days Chris is at night. It was all set. But so I said, man, this is the biggest summer. This is the biggest story of the decade. Where's LeBron James going to go? And so for those 3 weeks, I literally worked around the clock. I was like, I'm just going to bust my tail and try to, break all this news. And I broke Wade and Bosh. I obviously was up there on, with the LeBron stuff. I was plugged in. I had stuff on Amari Stoudemire, Chris Paul, Joe Johnson. Like I was just had a ton of stuff that summer because I was literally working around the clock. And when I wasn't on a set at the studio, I was on my phone, all that. I was getting like 2 hours of sleep, 3 hours of sleep for that time. And so ESPN kept having me on, even though I was scheduled just for the day. They had me on at night too. And I was on, there were days I was literally, no lie, at the studio 18 and 19 straight hours.
Crazy.
I go in for Mike and Mike at 6 a.m. and be there until 1 a.m., and so after that, ESPN was like, man, he's breaking all this news, we want to make him, they didn't never say these words, but I got the sense they were thinking, okay, Chris can be our Adam Schefter of the NBA,
Yeah, let's shift. That's your new primary role now.
Yeah. And in their mind, that's what they kind of felt like. And I never wanted that role.
Yeah.
And now
there's a lot of stress that comes with that role too. Not only the lack of sleep and all that, but a lot of stress too, putting yourself out there and, confirming with sources, and things are so fluid. Situations are so fluid. Something can be right 1 second and wrong the next. There's a lot that comes with that kind of role. I always talk about that's a very stressful spot to be in.
Yeah. It really is when you made a good point. A lot of reports, you might report that two teams are talking about a deal and it doesn't happen. And the public looks at it like, well, you were wrong.
Yeah, no,
you weren't wrong.
They definitely
really were
it just
talking.
didn't happen.
Yeah, exactly. And the way I was working during that 3 weeks in 2010 with LeBron, that's how you kind of have to work that's how Woj works year round.
Yeah.
360 days a year, he's working like that. And I'm not trying to do that. Not that I don't want to work hard, but I also want to, I have a lot of other interests. That's just really not to be honest, that's not even my personality, to be on the phone all day, every day, badgering people. That's just not really who I am. And so, but, ESPN began looking at me in that role. And so, I did it to some degree. And, I heated it up. I picked it up on the big stories, like when Kevin Durant's a free agent or, a big guy that names a free agent. I really honed in on those stories and, really, just turned it up. But, I did not go at it like Woj does, and that's the credit to him. But, I was more interested, like I said, I was doing feature stories. I wanted to do TV, I wanted to do sit-down interviews, I wanted to do the debate, all that was more of what I wanted to do. And now I love doing radio.
Yeah, it worked out because being able to break news and get your name out there and become a household name led to all these opportunities. So it seems like it worked out. One or two more questions for you real quick. Having a thick skin, how important is that? Because as you mentioned, the public, they can, attack you and say, oh, things, this didn't happen, even though you said these teams talked, and there's a lot of criticism. Anytime you're putting reports out there or you're saying something, especially now, you're a person that is constantly sharing their opinion. So sometimes it's negative. Sometimes it's something that a fan's not going to like. How important is it to have a thick skin, and how did you develop that? Did it take some time to develop that early on?
Yeah, I mean, you do have to have a thick skin. There is no question about it. And anybody who's in the public eye, if you look at whether it's athletes, politicians, in our case, reporters, you're going to be criticized. And especially when you're on a platform like ESPN. I remember, when I was at ESPN and Mark Stein and we're competing with Woj and stuff, we felt like when we break something, a lot of times it didn't get the attention as when Woj from Yahoo broke something, because people were looking at ESPN as, almost like, well, you should, or you're the big, the evil empire, whatever. And I remember when Woj went to ESPN, and then people are, Shams, broke a few stories, and people are like, oh, he's taken over Woj, he surpassed Woj, no, I mean, it was amazing how, okay, now that Woj was at ESPN, now all of a sudden he's, people are taking a story Shams breaks and giving him more credit for it than the stuff Woj would break. So you have to get used to that, especially when you're kind of at the top place.
Yeah.
But you also have to know what type of personality you are. If you're the type of and this goes for players too, there are some players, some reporters that can read all the criticism and use it as motivation, as fuel, or whatever. And then there are those that don't need to read anything because it messes with them, it gets in their mind. I think that's one reason LeBron, goes to the, he cuts off his social media in the playoffs because he doesn't want to be reading and hearing about, all the criticism and things like that. And so it's the same way for us. I really don't see a lot of my Twitter comments, positive or negative, from followers or from people out there.
Yeah, same here. I tell my wife to stay off Twitter too. That was a big one. She would get on there and see some stuff, and I'm like, "You gotta stay off Twitter, man. It's not my friends, my family. I tell them it's not worth it. Don't read it."
Yeah, and it's amazing because as much hate as you get on Twitter, I have never once, not one time, of the thousands of people that come up to me if I'm out somewhere and they say, "Oh, you Chris Broussard." Never once has anybody come up to me and been like, man, you're terrible, you're this, you're that, any of the negative stuff you see on Twitter. Oh, yeah, it's always, hey, you're great, I love you, can I get a picture? Blah, blah, blah. So you got to understand people have Twitter muscles. Yeah. And they'll say things on Twitter that they'll never say in public or whatever. But, yeah, I don't pay much attention to it. Again, that's really not my personality, to just be looking at Twitter all the time and concerned with what people are saying about me. So you do have to have thick skin, though, because you're going to hear the criticism. And even as a reporter with players, you have to be, as an opinionist, and this is one of the adjustments going to Fox Sports 1, I had to get used to, when I was at ESPN on SportsCenter, I was all 95 times out of 100, I would go on there and say what people were telling me. So, Chris, what's going on with this? And I'm saying, well, executives are saying, sources are saying, whatever. Now at Fox, I am supposed to say what I think.
Yeah, I think opinion. My opinion. Yeah, exactly.
And so there's a part of me that feels like, well, I got to hear what so-and-so says about it or what, whereas I really got to, they want me to just say what I think. So that's been an adjustment. But in doing that, you also open yourself up to more criticism from players. If I say, Portland should trade so-and-so, then when you see that player, he might not like that you said that, you know. And so you have to be ready. And I always face the fire. You know, I feel like if you're going to say stuff about players, you have to be willing to face that player. I remember last year, I had never met DeMarcus Cousins, you know, up till last year because, I wasn't at a lot of Sacramento games and stuff. And so I said things based off what people are telling me. People around the league, people in Sacramento within the organization, other players, things like that. And, you know, I said things about DeMarcus. And so I went to a game in L.A. where they played the Lakers, and I went up to DeMarcus in the locker room and introduced myself. I mean, he knew me, obviously, but, you know, and started talking with him. And, you know, he was like, yeah, I know. I seen what you've been saying. Have you ever met me? You know, you ain't never even talked to me, and you be saying this and that. You know, and I took it. I was like, look, man, you know, that's what I do. If you don't, I said, can I get your number so we can talk? Because if you don't talk to me, then all I can go on is what other people are saying.
Right.
You know, and so if you don't want to talk to me, then I have no choice but to say what so-and-so said about you or what so-and-so said about you. And he respected it. And, you know, so now we'll text here and there and, you know, so, but you have to be ready to face it. You can't break down when he comes at you like, oh man, you know, you don't even know me. And you said this, or you said that. You can't break down. You can't give in. You can't, you know, run away. You know, you can't avoid him and not even go up to him in the first place. Like, you have to be willing to let them speak their piece and carry yourself, treat them with respect and hear them out and then share your viewpoint. And when you do that, usually they'll respect you, you respect them, and you can get an understanding.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, tons of information there. You know, young journalists, I'm sure they can pick up a ton from, you know, that last half of the conversation. A lot of advice, a lot of lessons thrown out there from, you know, your early days to everything going on now. You can find all of Chris's work on FS1. Does a great job there. Find all of his work as well on Twitter at Chris_Broussard. Chris, I want to thank you, man. Thank you so much for making time to do this. I really appreciate it.
All right, my man. And keep up the good work, Alex.
Thank you. I appreciate that. This has been another episode of the HoopsHype Podcast. You can find all of our episodes on Audio Boom, SoundCloud, Google Play, Stitcher, and of course, HoopsHype.com. Until next time, thanks for listening.